Hi, everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, in Canada for webyeshiva.org. We're here at the Bayit, Beth Avraham Yosef of Toronto, and we are studying Moreh Nevuchim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. We are in section 2, chapter 6, which we started last week and which we're going to conclude today. If you are watching this live, allow me to wish you a happy Zot Chanukah, the final day of Hanukkah, which has special import in mystical literature, and may it be a very special day for you. We are discussing in Maimonides the idea of malachim, of angels. What are angels in the context of Jewish thought? And the Rambam, as a rationalist, seeks to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Jewish thought, with Jewish theology, and as a result, what we had seen up until we stopped last week in the middle of the chapter is that the word malach, the word angel, translates as angel, but it really just means an intermediary force by which God propagates his will to our reality. In other words, Maimonides acknowledges, using a type of Neoplatonic Aristotelianism that is in vogue in the medieval world in which he lives in the 12th century, that that God is in control of everything that occurs in our existence, but does not directly involve himself in everything that occurs, but does so through a series of emanations or of overflows of his essence, and through a series of concentric celestial spheres propagates his will to our world. And those forces of nature, whether physical forces or metaphysical forces of nature, make their way down into our world, all of God's will. And those intermediary forces that God employs in order to mete out his will, those are called malachim, those are called angels. So what we've seen so far is that the Rambam feels that there is no difference between what Aristotle described as celestial forces or forces of nature and the word angel or malach in Hebrew. In last week's, and I'm going to actually share my screen with you because this handout today, which is readily available on webyeshiva.org in their course description, and it's also available. Let's see, let me make sure that this screen is available. Yes, and is also available on the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevuchim. This handout really gives us a synopsis of the latter part of chapter 6. So the Rambam had defined for us 7 different ways in which the word malach is employed in Tanakh and in the words of Chazal, in the words of our sages. They are the intellects of the heavenly spheres, and that was the primary use that the Rambam was trying to explain malachim in this chapter. But also the word malach is that which moves living creatures, that which causes living creatures to either move or speak, as in the case of Bilam's donkey. They can be the elements. The elements are forces of nature that bring about different combinations and like fire, earth, water, air. These things are also malachim in that they are employed by God to bring about different phenomena in our words. A human messenger can be a malach, and the special case of that is a prophet, can also be called a malach. Separate intellects or imaginary visions within a prophecy are also called malachim. That is, when a person is dreaming or in a dreamlike state, as we'll see the Rambam describe in the latter part of this of our chapter today. Those imaginary visions are also called a malach because those are implanted in one's mind, ultimately going back to God. But those visions inspire a person to action, and therefore anything that is causative, that brings about a desired effect, is called a malach. Also, animalistic forces within living creatures. which we're going to see in the story of Yehuda and Tamar. If a person has an urge or a desire that is part and parcel of their very nature, then that nature is also called a malach, an intermediary force in order to propagate that which God deems that He wishes to be done. So we're picking up on page 263, where we're discussing, and really instead of reading the text because it's a little bit lengthier, I'm just going to provide us with an outline of 11 items to break down the chapter. When God said, "Let us make man," the Rambam had concluded by talking about the times when God speaks in the plural, in a way suggesting that He is consulting with another party. Our sages make note of the fact that God consulted the angels before choosing to create mankind. But the Rambam says it would be a mistake to take that literally, that God needed advice from beings whom He had created. So God was not consulting with the angels, but rather noting that as creator, He would utilize intermediary forces to create man and all of creation. So when our sages depict God as consulting with angels, it means that God said, I am going to employ you, intermediary forces, whether they are celestial intelligences or other kinds of intermediary forces that I have created in order to propagate my will. I'm going to utilize you in order to bring about the creation of man and really, in general, all of creation. So, just by analogy, God causes it to rain in order to cause things to grow. The rain, therefore, is an angel of God, or is a malach, an intermediary force in order to cause growth. Similarly, when God addresses the angels, the malachim, what our sages are depicting is that God is not directly connecting to physical phenomena in our world, but is using intermediary forces to propagate and bring about that which needs to be created. He therefore gives an analogy on the bottom of page 263 of a woman becoming pregnant and gestating a fetus. How does a woman become pregnant, and how does a fetus gestate inside her womb? So he says that there's a lot of superstition that the Rambam acknowledges exists in his time. And the belief of the common man is that a woman becomes pregnant through some angel allowing the semen to meet with the egg in her womb and causing her to become pregnant. And then that angel also causes the fetus to grow and to gestate within her womb. So he says if an ignorant person would be told that an angel is forming the fetus inside her womb, he would accept this. But he would also believe that the angel is that this angel is a fiery being whose size is 1/3 of the entire world. Now, what the Rambam is quoting from is a medrash, and the medrash in Bereshit Rabbah, which you have here on your handout, says it asks the question, "Uminayin shehamalach shlisho shel olam." From where do we know that an angel's wingspan is 1/3 of the world? Now, it's a very bizarre question for the Medrash to ask, but the Medrash is describing the vision that our patriarch Jacob had when he had this vision of the ladder and the angels going up and going down the ladder. And the Medrash is telling us that it was really an awesome vision. It was so awesome that the magnitude of the beings that Jacob envisaged in his prophetic dream was overwhelming in size. The angels had a wingspan that was 1/3 the size of the world. And then it quotes a pasuk in Daniel, which compares the body of the angel to Tarshish. And this is the Medrash says that this is a reference to the body of water that is called the Tarshish Ocean. And the Tarshish Ocean, whether it's the Mediterranean or whether it's the Atlantic Ocean, is unclear, but it is considered to be 1/3 of the span of the world. And so therefore, that's how we know that an angel is the angel's girth or width is 1/3 of the length of the world. So therefore, this angel that is responsible for the gestation of the fetus is this huge, amazing being that has somehow some kind of physical form. And that's the provincial, superstitious view of what angels are. But if you tell him that the angel is a biological force contained within the sperm that causes reproduction, he would shrink from this opinion. That's the language that Pines uses to translate what the Rambam is saying. If you tell him that the word angel is not referring to literally a sentient being, but is rather referring to a force that exists within nature that combines the genetic material of the man's bodily fluids with the woman's bodily fluids. And because of that combination, because of the chain reaction, the biological reaction that is created, a child is conceived and it forms into a zygote, and there's cellular splitting until the child forms into a fetus. Now, of course, I'm using a more modern depiction, but it's the same idea. That whole process of gestation is a malach as well. The word malach simply means a method that God employs in order to propagate his will. In this case, it is a biological rule of nature that that when the reproductive materials within a man's semen combines with the reproductive materials in a woman's egg, the sperm inseminates the egg, and that's what causes reproduction. There's no magic here. There's no sentient angel with wings coming down and watching over the genetic material that is gestating. It just is simply a rule of nature. That rule of nature is also called an angel, a malach. Similarly, if you suggest that all matter is formed by the active intellect, who is also an angel, known as Sar Ha'olam, this person, this provincial superstitious person, would also shrink from this opinion. Now, we've mentioned in a previous chapter, I think it was chapter 49, I don't recall exactly which chapter it was, but we did have a lecture about what this term active intellect is. The active intellect, as we've explained previously, is the sentient intelligence that the Rambam assigns to the lowermost sphere, what is called the lunar sphere, or the sphere that is closest to our planet, to our physical reality. The belief was that this angel, it's called the Seichel HaPoel, or Al-Aqal al-Fa'al in Arabic. It is known as an angelic being that is responsible for receiving all of the prior emanations that came from God and interacting most intimately with physical reality. And therefore, this lowest most angel or sentience or intelligence of the spheres provides form for all of matter. It also provides intellectual enlightenment to mankind. Because this angel is so overarching in its influence upon physical reality, the Rambam identifies this angel also as also the Sar Ha'olam. This is a term which Chazal make reference to in a number of places throughout the Talmud and in the Midrash, and we'll just take a look at a couple of those places. One is in Tractate Chulin, page 60a, Darash Rabbi Chanina Bar Papa. Rabbi Chanina Bar Papa expounded as follows: Yehi chavod Hashem le'olam, yismach Hashem b'ma'asav. That may the glory of God endure forever, may God rejoice in his actions. Pasuk zeh sar ha'olam, this verse was recited by the angel of the world, or this archangel. And Rashi in Sanhedrin calls this angel Malach Shekol Ha'olam Masur Biado, an angel to whom the entire world is given over, which means that this angel has ultimate sort of control and is God's largest angelic representative to propagate God's will throughout the world. So there are smaller angels, there are angels who are given very specific minor tasks, but this angel, according to Chazal, is the archangel who is in charge of generally the maintenance of the entire world. And Amru Bisha Sha'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Leminehu Bi'ilanot. And so we actually don't have time to go into the entire text of the Talmud, But the Talmud basically is saying that this angel, when he saw how creation itself was fulfilling God's will, basically rejoiced and said that all of creation is reflective of God's glory, and God rejoices in his creation because of that reflection. Another reference is in also Talmud Bavli Tractate Yevamot, Daf Tet Zayin Amud Bet, page 16b. Amar Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmeni Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Pasuk Zeh Sar Ha'olam Amro. The following verse was recited by the Sar Ha'olam, this archangel. Where is it? It's in Psalms chapter 37. You may be familiar with this verse because it's in the Birkat Hamazon. Nar Hayiti Gam Zakanti. I was young, and then I became old. V'lo ra'iti tzadikne ezav v'zaro mevakesh lachem, and I never saw a righteous person forsaken or his descendant requiring food. Man omrei, who said this verse? In other words, who has this perspective of all of human history to be able to make that affirmative declaration that there has never been a tzaddik that has been forsaken by God? Ilema kudshabrichu miika zikna kamei. Could not have been God himself saying this verse, because how can you say that God was young and then grew old? That's heretical. God is ageless. Ve'ela David amrei mikashish kulehai. David himself could not have said that. He didn't live that long to be able to look at a panoramic view of all of human history. No one can look at only things that they've seen in their lifetime and make such a declarative affirmation that there has never been a tzaddik forsaken. Ela shma mina sar ha'olam amro. So you require an entity that is not God, but has lived for eternity, or has lived as long as the world, as man has been around, who can make this kind of declaration after looking at a panoramic view of all of human history. And therefore, it must be this Sar Ha'olam. Now, who is this Sar Ha'olam? So the Rambam equates it to this Aristotelian, Neoplatonic entity called the active intellect. Now, we've explained before, when we first had our discussion of the Seichel HaPoel, the active intellect, that Aristotle did not give a clear depiction of this entity that the Rambam calls the active intellect. It was really Al-Farabi and other later philosophers who developed the idea of the Seichel HaPoel and incorporated it within Neoplatonic thought that was in vogue at that period of time. Al-Farabi living in the 9th century. So that idea was developed by Avicenna and other people who came after Al-Farabi, and then the Rambam adopts this depiction of this angelic entity. There's a lot of subtle discussion about how to define it. There's disputes within the philosophers as the scope and this level of sentience and free will that this entity has. We're not going to get into any of that right now. What's interesting is that this angel is also known by another name, and the Shalah HaKadosh in his Kabbalistic writing says, Noda ki Metatron Sar Ha'olam. We know that Metatron, who is discussed in some of the apocryphal literature and some Kabbalistic literature, is none other than this Sar Ha'olam. And we're not, and he therefore explains that that the word Metatron, which is probably of Greek origin, says that the word also derives as Shomer Hasha'ar. It is someone who Hashomer beratzon Hashem Yitbarach umatara hu targum shel shomer. That the word matara in Aramaic translates into the guardian of the world. Kemo sheherichu hamikubalim. He refers us to Rabbeinu Bechaya in his Torah commentary to Shemot chapter 24. There's so much that we could expand on this idea. But the Rambam, of course, as we know, is not a Kabbalist, and he focuses on the intersection between the philosophy of his time, which he views as scientific fact, to the writings that are contained within our tradition. And therefore, he says that this active intellect, this Seichel HaPoel, this Metatron, is none other than the angel that is depicted in Aristotelian philosophy. Just a quote from a contemporary author, Henry Corbin, who wrote a book called Avicenna and the Visionary Recital in 1960. He writes, the active intelligence is the intelligence that interacts most directly with the human intellect and the sublunar world, and thus represents the angel described in religious scriptures that interacts most with man in this world. For Muslim philosophers, the active intellect is the angel Gabriel, the angelic entity who embraced Muhammad and provided him with the Quranic prophecies. For Christian philosophers, the active intellect is the Holy Spirit of the Trinitarian Godhead. For Jews, the active intellect is the angel Metatron, who is depicted as the theophanic manifestation of God himself. In other words, whenever, anytime man has a prophetic vision of God, he is actually interacting with this angel Metatron. So this is what the Rambam is basically suggesting, is that while there are people who are of superstitious thinking, who have no conception of this idea of an active intellect which interacts with our world on an automatic basis as part of being basically a physical rule of nature, a law of nature in medieval science, they don't relate to angels in that way, and therefore cannot get their head around this idea that I'm presenting to you now. Point number 4, because we are running out of time. Just as there are general universal forces like heat, cold, wind, etc., and individual forces that are localized to certain times and places, so do the sages make reference to angels who are all-encompassing and eternal, and angels who are temporary and sent for only one purpose. So therefore, what the Rambam means by this is that you know that we have sort of like universal elements and forces that are described in Aristotelian science, like earth, wind, fire, and water. And Aristotle describes them as existing in the ether, as being universals, as being perennial forces that exist. Or we have forces like wind and air that exist out in the ether as general forces, but then are localized many times with a hurricane or a tornado or a heat wave or things like that. So too, that's exactly the way our sages depict angels. There are universal angels, and there are specific angels who are brought into this world to fulfill one specific task, and then after their task is finished, those angels dissipate and cease to exist. So what he's quoting here, there are a number of midrashim that the Rambam quotes. One of them is from Bereshit Rabbah on Parshat Vayera, using the verse in Job, "V'hu be'echad umi yeshivenu," that God utilizes one being, umi yeshivenu, and who can tell God to do otherwise? V'nafsho ivetavayat, whatever God wishes to do, he does. That's what the verse in Eov says. And on that, the Medrash tells us, Tana, ein malach echad oseh shtei shlichot, that one angel cannot do two jobs. God utilizes individual forces, individual natural phenomena to propagate his will. That's the way the Rambam is reading this Medrash. V'lo shnei malachim osim shlichut echad, nor can two angels do one proxyship or agency, active agency. Um, and as an illustration, Michael Amar Bisuroto Vinistalek, that when God, why did God send 3 angels to Abraham? Because he sent Michael, the angel Michael, to notify Sarah that she was going to have a child. He sent Gabriel to overturn and destroy the city of Sodom, and he sent the angel Raphael to save Lot from Sodom. So those are the 3 angels that came to visit Avram. That's a reference to the idea that God makes use of different forces at different times for individual objectives that God wishes to accomplish. But and yet at the same time, there are these archangels, these general forces, and that's the way Rambam understands the archangels, or the active intellect. Similarly, another medrash that the Rambam makes reference over here is from Bereshit Rabbah on Parshat Vayishlach, where it says, Rabbi Chelbo b'shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman Omar, Le'olam ein kat shel mala mikaleset v'shoneh, that you never have one group of angels that repeats its praises to God for more than one day. Ella b'chol yom borei hakadosh baruch hu kat shel malachim chadasha v'hein omrim shira chadasha lefanav v'holchim lahem. And so therefore God creates a new entourage of angels every single day. And then once that day is over, those angels dissipate and they cease to exist. Now, the problem with that is that we know the story in Parshat Vayishlach that Jacob, Yaakov, had a wrestling match with an angel who seems to live beyond the dawn. So it says Vahaketiv, and this is the question asked by the Medrash. Vayomer shalcheni ki Allah hashachar v'giyaz mani lomar shira. Look at what the angel said to Jacob: "Send me, because it is time for me to go back up to heaven," which implies that this angel was living beyond that night in which Jacob and the angel were wrestling. So Amar Li, Chanukah Savart Lemit Lemechnekeni, Amarit Mahu Dein Dichtiv Ayomer Shalcheni Ki Allah Shachar, Amar Li Ze Michael veGavriel Shein Sarim Shalmala Dukulam Mitchalfin V'inon Lo Mitchalfin. And the answer is, explains the Medrash, you thought that you would catch me with that verse. There are different classes of angels. There are some angels who are created for only one purpose, and there are other angels who are archangels who are created for universal purposes. And the Rambam understands that this is not a description of actual angelic entities with wings, but rather natural forces. There are certain localized natural forces like a hurricane or a heat wave, and then there are universal forces that exist perennially. And so, as just to quote, for the individual forces are being constantly generated and corrupted, whereas the species to which these forces belong are permanent and do not become defective. So that's point number 4. Point number 5, the term malach as intermediate force also refers to the animalistic drives that human beings have, such as sexual urges, as witnessed by the Midrash of Yehuda and Tamar. That a sexual urge or any other kind of human instinct or urge is also called a malach. It's an intermediary force that God created within a human being to cause a human being to act out on certain urges. Now, this doesn't suggest that the Rambam negates the idea of free will. Every human being has free will, but we also have sexual tendencies, we have other kinds, we have hunger tendencies, we all have what we would call biological predispositions and predilections. And those are called malachim as well. Those are intermediary forces which incline us in different directions. And therefore, when the Medrash describes the idea of, and we won't have time to read it inside, but the Medrash describes an angel being created by God to force Yehuda to submit to the seduction of Tamar, whom he thought was a prostitute on the road. And the Medrash says it was an angel who did this. The Rambam says all that means is that it was Yehuda's own sexual urge within himself that pushed him in that direction. Even though he tried to resist that urge, he ultimately succumbed to it. And that's all that Medrash means. It doesn't mean that God created an invisible angel that pushed him, but rather using a very rational approach to the term malach. Malach also refers to the point number 6. Malach also refers to the imagination faculty. And the word kruv, which is the higher level of angel, if you recall from last week, we looked in the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, the Rambam had said that there are many different levels of angels. The lowest level of angel is called Ishim because it interacts directly with mankind, but the level above that is called the Kruv, the cherub, and that refers to the intellect. These are intermediaries employed by God to implant an idea within man's mind. And so therefore, a vision that I may have in my imagination faculty, in my mind, is in effect a malach as well. It is a means by which God seeks to inspire me to a certain direction or idea through implanting within my mind a vision. And that therefore is consistent with the Medrash that says, B'sha'ah Adam yashen, when a man is sleeping, Haguf omer l'neshama, the body speaks to the soul, V'haneshama l'nefesh, and the soul speaks to the nefesh, which is a different level of soul, V'hanefesh l'malach, and then the nefesh speaks to an angel, V'hamalach omer l'kruv, and the malach speaks to the kruv, etc., etc. There's a chain reaction going all the way up to the heavenly realm. Now, what that means, according to the Rambam, is not something supernatural, but rather it simply means that there is a connection to the human psyche that God creates through a chain of intermediary forces that are called malachim by virtue of the fact that they are intermediary forces of nature, not that they are some kind of winged being. Number 7, anytime mention of a vision of an angel appears in scripture, it exists only in the vision of prophecy. The Rambam is very clear. He wants to make sure that we understand that, and this is a big point that we are only going to be touching on today, but we will expand upon when we discuss later chapters in this section, which deal with the rules of prophecy or the principle of prophecy that the Rambam spends a very large amount of time discussing. But prophecy, whenever a prophet has a vision of an angel, it is not ontological. It doesn't exist outside in the real world, but rather it's an epistemological vision. It means that every time an angel is depicted in scripture, it is not a physical angel on this world, but rather is projected into the mind of the prophet. This is a huge, huge statement, and the stakes of this statement are huge. And we're not going to get into it right now, but bear in mind that this has huge ramifications. Anytime the Torah depicts whether it's Avraham having 3 visitors visit him after his Brit Milah, that is in a vision that did not actually exist on the physical plane. And even the Akedah Yitzchak, according to the Rambam, there was no angel that actually grasped Avraham's hand and stayed his hand from slaughtering Isaac. This was all part of a vision. There was no angel who was projected into the physical plane. And okay, big statement. We're going to come back to this over and over again over the next few weeks. Point number 8, angels sometimes appear to people as men, other times as terrifying men, other times as fire, and other times as angels. So for example, Avraham saw the angels as men. Manoach's wife saw an angel as a terrifying man, because when she describes in the book of Judges to her husband, Isha Elokim bo Elai, Umar Ehu Kimalach Malacha Elokim Nora Ma'od. She describes a man of God who came to me in a vision, and he looked like an angel of God who was very fearsome and scary. Moshe saw an angel in the form of fire in the story of the burning bush, as is described in Exodus chapter 3. And to Lot, they appeared as angels. And the Rambam tells us something in passing, which is quite unusual. He says, the more connected to God, the lower in stature the angel will appear. This explains the reason why Avram saw the angels as men, whereas Lot saw them as angels. Now, just to explain what the Rambam means over here, it's a very simple idea that is based on a medrash in Medrash Rabbah on Parshat Vayera. The medrash asked, why did Avraham see the angels as men, whereas Lot saw them as angels? It would seem almost counterintuitive. But the answer is that the closer one is with God, the less the less impressive the angels appear, because I am basking in the divine presence. So when you're basking in sunlight, moonlight looks more pale. But when you're not basking in sunlight, when you're in the dark, the moon appears to be very bright. Similarly, when you're basking in divine prophetic conjunction with God himself, and an angel comes onto that scene, the angel appears to be less impressive. It only has the visage of a human being. But when you're in the dark and you're not being graced by God, the angel appears as something quite extraordinary to you in your vision, and therefore they appear to Lot as angels. Another reason why the angels appeared as men to Avram is because they had not yet arrived to the place of their agency, namely Sodom. And the Rambam quotes this from the Medrash also. Note the fact that when they first came to Avraham, they had not yet reached their final destination where they could fulfill their agency of destroying the city of Sodom. They were on their way to Sodom, and when an angel is in the process of fulfilling its agency but has not yet reached its final destination, it appears as a man. When it appears at its point of final destination, it appears as an angel, as an angelic being. And that's the second reason cited by the Medrash why they look like men when they came to Avraham, whereas they look like angels when they came to Lot, to the place of Sodom. And we won't have time, unfortunately, to read the Medrash, but you have it there in your handout. And finally, point number 11, and this is where the Rambam gives basically his synopsis of this whole chapter. Everything Aristotle teaches about forces is consistent with what the Torah states about angels. This concluding statement is the same way that he started the chapter. But he says there's one exception. Aristotle believes that these forces slash angels have existed eternally and were never created, and that they proceed necessarily from God without will. That it's really basically just scientific, scientific and mechanistic, in that this just is a natural emanation from God, and that there is no volition for these angels to do other than what they were. Basically, it's a mechanistic process, that there are forces of nature that emanate from God ultimately through a chain reaction of celestial bodies. And therefore, anything that happens in this world really is a product of some system that cannot be tampered with, because it's completely mechanized and is eternally running, like an eternal clock that just keeps on running and fulfills its function. We, however, believe that these forces slash angels were number one, created by God, and that number two, God implanted within each celestial sphere the desire to conjoin with these intelligences, that these intelligences or angels have sentience, they have will, not the same thing as human free will, and the Rambam will clarify this in next week's chapter, chapter 7, but nonetheless, a sentience and a will and a desire to fulfill God's will. And so there is a difference of opinion between the Aristotelian depiction of angels and the Maimonidean depiction of angels, but it boils down to this last point. Were they created, or have they existed eternally? And secondly, do they operate mechanistically, automatically, based on rules of science that were set into motion from time immemorial? Or is God controlling the process volitionally so that it can change from time to time depending upon his will? Okay, that concludes this chapter for today. There was a lot of material, and I recognize that it's a lot of things to take in. So let me wish you again a good day. We were already over time, and we'll pick it up with chapter 7 of section 2 next time. Take care now.